I'll lead off and just say that from the agency perspective, I suppose if we were to look at the most central part of us thinking about the responsibility in our business, it's really about choices that we make about the brands and the clients and the sectors that we work with. And it's particularly pertinent at certain stages in agency development. We've got about 40 clients, so we've got a lot of clients in a lot of sectors. And that means that there are only some places we can go now, and some of those places can be quite contentious. I think there are some industry sectors and brands that are quite easy for agencies to take a position on. And I can think of the agencies I've worked in over the years where, whether it's tobacco, e-cigarettes, payday loans, gambling, online gambling, agencies have had fairly straightforward stance on those, which is that as responsible businesses, they choose not to work with those clients or sectors. But equally, there are more nuanced areas, not least because we all work in an economy that's evolving rapidly. And what I think is interesting is this idea that we should just be like lawyers, perhaps. We're paid advocates. We should represent anyone that's got the budget and comes forward to work with us. But it doesn't really work like that because I think the popular perception that the marketing industry and agencies are populated by the kind of the spear carriers of capitalism. You know, we're all rabid free marketeers whose view is if it's legal, then we should be able to market it. That isn't really the case because I think agencies are populated by very thinking, quite questioning people, and the best people in agencies are by their nature empathetic. That's how they manage to create powerful communications, because they can put themselves in the shoes of the people that they're trying to communicate with. So what's interesting in a number of cases is that we may have some very clear areas that we may choose not to grow into, but equally we've made decisions where you start to work in a sector or with a client, and very quickly you realize that you perhaps made the wrong step, or your people come to you and tell you that you've made the wrong step. And I can think we started working in a previous agency. We pitched for a really, really big, it's a kind of science, engineering, logistics business, a big British success story on the global stage. They had a really, really interesting, actually sort of civil defense type brief that they were talking about. It was just after 7/7, so it was very, very interesting to us. We started working with them, and then the first briefs that came in were actually for what were effectively weapons. And they were it was a B2B campaign to sort of, the Pentagon and the Saudi royal family, basically. And we looked at it and thought, well, this is now suddenly very uncomfortable. But it became quickly apparent that certainly none of the planners and creatives were going to touch this at all. So we quickly had to step back from that. And I think we'd sort of slightly blundered into an area that everyone else in our business thought, this isn't a responsible place to be. And so it's those kind of questions that I think when you're trying to grow an agency. But those questions are important because we're not just paid advocates for anything that comes along. We have responsibilities, and we have responsibilities because what we do is proven to be very effective. And we have to think about our effectiveness, but also our ethics. We're also businesses that are quite fragile because we're not about heavy plant or machinery or in the main technology, we're about people. And that means that agencies are quite delicate organisms. So if you bring in the wrong clients with the wrong cultures or the wrong values, you can destroy your business. And I think the third thing is that it's also about good work. And Adam and Eve DDB, the DDB part of that was founded by Bill Bernbach on Madison Avenue in the States in the 60s. And he's an advertising legend, and he had a lot of things to say about what we do and how we do it well. And he said, our job is to sell, but it is not to pollute or diminish culture when we pursue the aim of selling. And so it's about doing good work for good clients. But it's also about good business, because I think the funny thing as agencies is when you take an irresponsible step and you work with the wrong client in the wrong sector, it's not good for your business. Because again, another Bernbach quote, he said, life's too short to work with sons of bitches. And I think what I've found, and having done a startup, you kiss quite a lot of frogs along the way, And we certainly work with some people where you suddenly realize you're working with people who don't have straightforward business ethics. You're not getting paid on time. Perhaps you're not getting paid at all at the end of a job. And actually, that's because you've strayed into the wrong sector. So I think it's important for us as businesses not just to view ourselves as paid advocates. If it's legal, then we can step up and do it. We have sensitive organizations, and we have to take decisions as leadership teams, but also as large business organizations listening to our people. David?
Right, okay. Right, we're now going to sit down and we're going to talk to you. So I think, look, this week you would have seen from The Guardian we've embarked on a new business plan. Some of it is about putting the business in order and having a bit more of a credible business plan, but much more of it is about closeness of relationships with our readers and indeed our advertising. And I suppose through all of this clutter, and one might describe it as huge disruption, I suppose what's important is that you have to do this the most sort of trusted, ethical and purposeful way. And I think, thankfully, given The Guardian's purpose and how long we've been around, this isn't a little fad we've just come to in the last week. This has been something that we've been doing for probably about 200 years. So the title of this, I think, is probably very apt, but it's something that we've been doing for an awful long time. I mean, we were established in 1821. We came about because we were reporting on things that people simply didn't want to talk about. And in the case in 1819, it was the Peterloo Massacre, and we stepped into that. And I suppose we were rooted then from our very, very first edition in disruption, holding people to account, being purposeful, having a very, very, very strong sense of what is right and what is wrong. And as a result of that, obviously we've gone from a sort of small little news sheet paper in Manchester to being one of the biggest and largest media organisations in the world. And we have to do that because we recognise our social impact, both on our employees, on behalf of our advertisers and our readers. And we have to champion diversity. These are not words that we're embarrassed about. Inclusion, education, social environment, community, etc. These, I believe, are the buzzwords of any credible media brand, or indeed any brand in the world. We've also got the Guardian Foundation, which is a registered charity that sits outside GMG. And we have a duty to educate, to celebrate human rights and the right for information. And we've also got values which we are very beholden to, and they impact everybody, both on what we write, what we produce, and indeed who we hire. And they are around sort of honesty, integrity, courage, fairness, and a sense of duty to the reader. These values, I suppose, are as important as they were 200 years ago as they are today. And I believe those values and our sense of purpose that has allowed us to go from 9th largest newspaper to the 3rd largest in the world. And those values and purpose and mission means that 2/3 of our traffic come outside of the UK, and which is why in the US, we're the 2nd fastest growing news site in the US, 55% growth year on year. And indeed in Australia, we've also got 40 or 50% growth there, and we're now a top 4 site in Australia. And I suppose, why therefore does brands work for us? And I suppose sometimes people say there's a contradiction between that purpose and indeed that we're part funded by the advertising industry, of which we celebrate, embrace, and some of the work we've done recently, and I'll talk about Guardian Labs in a second, means we're very much part of this ecology, but we obviously want to do it informed by our values and who we are. We launched Guardian Labs. I think we were one of the first to be able to create a very dedicated unit to bringing both the innovation that we produce in our content and bring that to bear with agencies and clients. And we've done some huge campaigns around EE. We've worked with Unilever, Beagle Street, etc. And all of that really is about bringing fantastic storytelling, a genuine understanding of how digital works and how people are consuming content across multiple platforms, and using our experience to help brands tell their stories. They're always 100% clearly labeled, and there is nothing ever in our DNA that suggests that we should ever want to blur the lines between editorial or indeed commercial. But to be clear, there's no blacklist. I don't think there's any hidden list that sits in our organisation that's to say that we've got advertisers we wouldn't work with. I think on there's a case-by-case evaluation, as James has said, about what the brief is and what people are ultimately trying to do. I have to say, I've never met a client who comes in to say, what I want to do is blur editorial and commercial because I want to deceive somehow the audience and get my brand across. They wouldn't want to come and talk to us about that because we'd show them the door. What actually brands and are grappling with is how do we, in this incredibly complex, very, very challenging market of how do you ultimately create credible and authentic engagement with the reader or indeed their consumer. And we believe, obviously, we have a way of telling stories that allow us to be able to add value to that. We don't blur those lines, though there are some of our nearest competitors who do. I thought I might say that. I think that the days of buying reach and influence, I don't think it really matters about how much money you've got. If you want to buy your way to be able to create engagement and influence, I think those days are over. And I believe that consumers are smart enough to evaluate when a brand is being credible or indeed the advertising is really being thought about and cared about in terms of creating that engagement. And I think we have to think about quality experiences. We do have to think about always those tone of seduction that advertising is so good at, but we just need to be very, very careful how we do that and do it in the most authentic and trustful and purposeful way. One of the truth points or the data points that suggests that perhaps we're not doing it as well as we should be, I suppose, is the trend of ad blocking. 40% up year on year, global impact of billions of dollars being lost. And I think if there was a data point that we want to point to that suggests that some of this stuff we're getting wrong would be people saying, actually, do you know what? I really don't want your advertising. And I suppose programmatic and targeting and data is all great and provides the necessary ROI that we all crave, but also it creates some brutal targeting, which means perhaps the wrong messages get to the wrong people, particularly with the wrong content. So I do believe that we have to use all these tools, whether it be storytelling, whether it be the traditions of advertising, but be far more purposeful in terms of how we engage with our readers, because creativity, craft is always still very, very important, but a duty and care to the reader is more important than all of that.
Okay, I think it's my turn now. When I switched from the private sector to go and work for first Oxfam and then Save the Children some years back now, I thought it would be quite straightforward, this responsibility question, because obviously inherently what these organisations were trying to do was all about behaving responsibly. But clearly that was a little bit naive because we needed to be scrupulously careful about how we were doing what we were doing. And that means who we were working with and the behavior of those people, our own staff, but our partners around the world. And nowhere was that more important than the big, high-profile corporate partnerships that have become increasingly more the norm over the years that I've been in this sector. So choices really have to be made about who to work with. You know, if you're an Oxfam or a Save the Children, a very well-respected and trusted brand, you have to choose who your partners are and who you will associate your brand with. And obviously, every NGO is going to be different and is going to make those decisions differently based on their own mission and set of values and so on. But I would say that regardless, there are probably three key criteria that you have to consider in making the decision about who to work with. The first one is about the brand, and you just can't afford to have too much blowback on your own precious brand that could cause brand damage. That's fairly straightforward, I think. The second point is more about the core mission of your organization, because it's too easy for an NGO to inadvertently actually, through a partnership, work against their mission. So by taking funding and co-sponsorship from a company, for example, that works in a particular country against children's rights, if you're Save the Children, is clearly not going to be furthering your mission, even if it provides some healthy revenues to enable you to go out and raise more funds or deliver programs in another part of your organization. And the third criteria is perhaps more in tension with those first two, because the first two kind of point you towards don't take the risk, it's just not worth it. But this is really the imperative about wanting to make a difference in the world. That's the responsible behaviour in the real world that these organisations like Oxfam, Save the Children and others are all about. And I think it's very naive to think that if you're going to make really big difference in the world, part of Save the Children's mission is to inspire changes in the way the world treats children, and NGOs aren't going to be able to do that by themselves, no matter how big or how bold. The private sector is playing a huge role in how the world treats children, either for the positive or for the negative. And therefore, you do need to engage with these big corporates if you're going to make the kind of change that our missions push us towards. So professional organisations like Oxfam and Save the Children and the large NGOs will have processes and governance procedures in place that enable us to make those kinds of decisions. But let me talk instead about the theory, about two real examples, perhaps from more controversial sectors. Obviously, many corporate partnerships, but to pick a couple of areas where perhaps we've had more question marks about, what are you doing getting engaged in that area? And the first one is around child labour, which really started coming to the fore in the 1990s. And IKEA was concerned about child labour in its supply chain because it was sourcing a lot of its materials and raw materials from Asia, and started talking to, it was really a conversation that began with Save the Children about how it could address those concerns. And then Save the Children started working with IKEA on a code of conduct to prevent child labour being an issue in its supply chain, which over the years really started to develop into much more of a proactive programme central to IKEA's purpose to create a better everyday life for many children, was the phrase that IKEA came up with. And that partnership grew over many years from no revenues associated to it, where it was really just advice and critique, through to the last count, 77 million euros that IKEA now raises and contributes to not just Save the Children, but UNICEF, to schools across Asia, Africa, and Central and Eastern Europe, making those schools more likely to result in a quality education. So interesting that developed over time out of quite a controversial area. The other area is big pharma, which, again, does raise some eyebrows. But when I was at Save the Children UK, when I joined about 10 years ago, shortly after that, Andrew Whitty became the chief exec of GSK and wanted to launch a program that would reinvest 20% of all the profits made in least developed countries by GSK back into those countries, and particularly into strengthening healthcare infrastructure. And then over the years, I moved on to Save the Children International, but over the years, that partnership grew into a much bigger program. It started really below the radar, not really known in the UK. Now GSK's staff fundraise for Save the Children, and there were some interesting announcements around GSK being willing to use its intellectual property, in one particular case, a mouthwash, to repurpose it to a product that could save children's lives. In this particular case, a gel to treat umbilical cords for newborns, where the largest number of deaths occur. And clearly there was a lot of media attention around that, and we were criticised, but I think we'd done our due diligence and we had a long-standing relationship, and we kind of were able to stand up and take that criticism on the chin and point to the impact, the target of saving 1 million children's lives around the world, and why that was worth it. So just a couple of lessons then, 5 lessons I would draw out in terms of these kinds of risks that it's imperative to take, but thoughtful. And the first one is about really weighing up, based on your principles, being very clear about your principles, but weighing up the cost-benefit equation and making sure that if you're entering into a partnership, it really is going to be worth it in terms of your mission. The second is to expect difficulties along the way and to be prepared for a long-term relationship and to be able to sort of work through the challenges. The third is to bring your staff along. You also mentioned staff, James. I mean, Save the Children's got 25,000 people around the world. And they're reading the headlines in many cases. And they won't get the backstory unless you tell them what the backstory is, why you've chosen to engage with certain partners. The fourth point is be prepared to end. It's interesting, we didn't confer, but a very similar point. Be prepared to end the relationship if necessary. Now, very rarely have we had to do that, but I think it's important that you never become overly dependent on a partnership or on revenues from one particular source. And that wouldn't just apply to companies, by the way, but to governments as well. So make sure that there is a sort of a sunset clause built in from the beginning. And my final takeaway point, if you remember nothing else, my key litmus test is around hypocrisy. Just make really sure that whatever you enter into is in line with what you've said you're going to do, and that you can weather any charges of hypocrisy by standing tall and pointing to, living up to your values.
Okay, thank you very much, Jasmine. So we've got a few minutes for some discussion around some of those topics that we've touched on. And also we've got some questions that have already come from the floor on these. And perhaps, Jasmine, we can start with you, but we can all talk to this. Is a question which, is there any such thing as irresponsible advertising for a critical cause?
Yes, well, funnily enough, this was the other thing that when we were talking about what the association wanted me to talk about, I said, well, what there's a lot of dilemma about is how you represent the causes that Save the Children is all about. So this whole, it's been known as the flies in their eyes, this whole thing about, is it unfair to represent, to put on screen, children dying around the world. And there's quite a heated debate about that, not surprisingly within the sector, but then more broadly. In fact, on the earlier conversation about self-regulation, I think that's where that has worked quite well, because we've then, within the sector, come up with some guidelines about what is appropriate, what is demeaning and does more harm, and what isn't appropriate. Now, my view is, and Save the Children, while I was running it, our view was that, we should not shy away from the brutal reality that is out there. Just because it's a bit distasteful or it's going to make somebody feel a bit uncomfortable, that's not a reason not to show it. But on the other hand, you do have to walk that line quite carefully because you don't want to be sending the wrong message. Now, Oxfam ran some very interesting ads. Maybe, being in London, some of you will have seen them. I think it was last summer on the Tube. Let's change the story about Africa. And there were lots of pictures of waterfalls and, beautiful things about Africa. That was very worthy, but I think at the end of the day, I wasn't inside Oxfam, but I'm not sure it really did the trick. So there is a fine line to be walked.
But perhaps the question is also the flies and eyes approach and so on works so far, but eventually people become either numb to it or they become simply feelings of hopelessness set in. And actually the idea that you can present something that is more positive or it could just be more poignant.
Well, so the point is you're absolutely right. You have to take people on a journey. But the point is you can't take people on a journey in a very short media space. So what you can do is you can grab their attention, and that's where this mix of different media becomes very interesting, because if you can then take people online, you can then start to show the much more complicated reality rather than just the soundbite or the image. Yeah.
David?
I suppose from our side, I suppose an analogy might be the way in which Kath Feiner and her team have to make judgment calls on how extreme do the images that come in that show and bring to light some of the things happening around the world. And those judgments are very thought through, whether it be what's happening in refugees, etc., what happens post-bombed out buildings in certain war-torn places around the world. Are you supposed to be sensationalizing that, or are you supposed to be telling a very credible story about what's happening? And I think one just has to be careful. I think the more extreme you are, people just turn off, as you say, and just become hopeless and think, well, I can't make any impact on that. But I don't think there's one blanket rule for all of it. I think it's about judgment.
I know we had, I think in some senses agencies can be quite inconsistent because we've done campaigns that have been deliberately very poignant and quite, soft focus. And then we've done other ones that have been deliberately hard-hitting. I remember we did one we were working with a campaign group to stop French nuclear testing in the South Pacific, in the Atoll Islands. And we created a short film that was effectively dramatized the assassination of the then French president. Okay, and it was sadly, perhaps a bit like one of the MP panellists referred to, it was a deliberate attempt to effectively provoke French public opinion into realising what their government were doing. But I think probably a good example where we found ourselves being asked to go too far was we worked with a charity, and I won't name them or even say, let's say hypothetically they were in the children's hospice space. They weren't, but it was something similar. And we'd done 3 years or so of some very effective fundraising campaigns, and they needed funds. And they got a new marketing director who said, I need you to do something much more hard-hitting and attention-grabbing because we need to be the brand leader in children's hospice charities and so on. And we suddenly realized that actually, and one of their own people told us, the agenda was actually an honor. They were looking for a gong. And someone in the sector was going to get a gong and they wanted to be there. So, and that was certainly the point at which we walked away. Although in some senses it could have been an opportunity to do something very hard-hitting, but it was clearly the agenda was wrong.
Yeah.
So we've got some other questions coming in, which are, does the panel have a view on how standards in the UK around advertising, media and ethics compare with other countries? You work in different territories.
I spend a lot of time in the States, and it is not clear to me that there are too many ethics around the quality of some of that advertising. I mean, some of it really is extreme, and as you see the sort of political agenda ramping up around the presidential process, you just look at it and just say there does seem to be very little safeguards about what is right and wrong. And I think the reason why, to sort of relate it back to why The Guardian, I think, has been successful over there, is because I think Americans particularly are desperate for some sense of what is right and what is wrong, and looking for some authentic voice. And I think there are some brands who have got that right, who feel like they've created a genuine connection with their consumers, and it genuinely feels authentic, and they've done it right. And then there are other parts of the sectors where you just sort of think anything goes, and they can do or say anything, and it doesn't matter. I suppose given the scale of the country, the varying qualities of standards by state, I suppose you can accept some of it, but there are times when you're sitting there watching the TV thinking, I cannot believe this has even found its way on air. And then no more evidence by what's happening around Trump and everything else about what can and cannot be said. So I see America as being something which has got a very conflicted way in which it manages its advertising messages, for sure.
Jasmine?
Well, I think for aid agencies, the messaging in the UK can be, I think, more controversial often than it can be in the US. So it's sort of, in a way, the opposite way round. But that could be also to do with the risk appetite of aid agencies in different countries. But then, you know, across Europe, again, it varies. I mean, if you look Northern Europe, Scandinavia could be, you know, even more hard-hitting. In many parts of the world where we work, you know, it's completely open in terms of what's acceptable in the media. But what we have to be concerned about more is the freedom of the press, and actually our relationship, the space for civil society, and our relationship with the authorities or the government.
Okay. And I mean, I think one thing I'd say from an agency point of view in the UK is that the fact that we are self-regulated, and actually that self-regulation sets high standards in comparison to other markets in terms of responsibility. One of the very, very beneficial outcomes of that is actually a higher standard of creativity, because I think, you know, you would look at UK marketing and say it has some of the most intelligent and well thought through campaigns anywhere in the world. And actually, that is at least partly, obviously there are clever people in agencies and client organizations, but actually some of it is just the regulatory framework that we work in that creates that climate. So we haven't got long, but this is one perhaps, Jasmine, for you to start with, which is Adidas dumping the IAAF the future of responsible advertising?
Well, not really one for me, I'm afraid. I'm not an expert in that area. But I mean, I do think that going back to the earlier panel as well, I think that's probably influenced by that as well to a certain extent, that, you know, what the public and how consumers, what they express, and by the way, you know, staff of companies, as you were saying, you know, they're ordinary people, how they express themselves and what they, you know, will and won't expect from their employers, from the the companies that they buy from will actually influence to a much greater degree than perhaps we realised in the past what companies and ultimately advertisers will think is appropriate.
And I think that there's a general openness now to the way in which, I suppose, internet and all things digital has made sure that every organisation probably has to be as open and as transparent as it can be with its audience. And the fact that badging a certain football tournament or an association with athletics used to be a relatively simple exercise. You could just sort of stick your logo on it and it'll all be fine. Whereas now those associations are now under far more scrutiny. But it's interesting, the conflicts around with FIFA and some of the huge brands associated with some of the biggest football tournaments in the world, how slow some brands have been to respond to say, should we or should we be associated with these things or not? And I've been surprised how long that's taken.
Yep.
I mean, on that point, I think you're dead right, and that links to one of the lessons that I have. Build your sunset clause in straight away, so at the beginning, so that you know when you've got the trigger points, and you know when it's gone over the limit, and you can move. It doesn't have to be in a big fiasco way. I mean, you can be very straightforward, but otherwise it just takes too long.
And it does take long, and the very thing you're asking the public to take the benefit of this sport associated with the values and benefits of that and bring that to the brand that's sponsored it, and meanwhile that sport is unravelling. And the brand, you can see them genuinely conflicted about what to do because it takes them months to respond.
And it is disappointing when you look at things like the FIFA situation and you almost see some really, really major global brands almost sitting there as if they're going, we sit in a parallel universe, this isn't our affair.
And then go onto the Twitter account and just watch the stream of abuse. And then they'll put out a little line to say, we're currently reviewing the situation, or we are a bit disappointed to hear. And meanwhile, the very thing that they've set out to do, which is to be associated with their sport, is unravelling faster than they can probably do.
And it's interesting to see that you've got that post the Adidas announcement. You've then got this week the BBC and BuzzFeed's expose of tennis match fixing, and then to see how quickly international tennis has now reacted to try and investigate that.
I think speed to response.
And I think they've clearly looked at, in action at FIFA, what's happened with Adidas and gone, we've got to move on this, do something. But so I'm afraid that's all we have time for in our section. So thank you very much, Jasmine. Thank you, David, very much. Thank you.